Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be going over the King's Gambit, beginning after e4, e5, pawn to f4 begins the King's Gambit, and more specifically today we're going to be looking at something called the Miles defense, which is a hyper-aggressive approach that Black can take, where he intends to counter Gambit in the most extreme possible way. He's going to play something like knight to c6 here, intending that after knight to f3, he's going to be following up with this move pawn to f5. This is called the Miles defense. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So the Miles defense, what can we do against it? Well, let's go back a move and let's see, what can we do against this move knight c6? Well, as you can see, we can't play the move f takes e5 because of the move queen h4 check, g3, queen takes e4 check is going to pick up that rook on h1, and we're going to be completely losing. So we have to pick a move here. Now, of course, if we play knight to f3, it does allow the Miles defense. It allows f5, where Black is making the argument that his knight on c6 is better placed than the knight on f3, because when any exchanges happen in the middle here, the knight on f3 can be kicked, but of course the knight on c6 is out of the line of fire and is therefore safe. That's sort of the argument being made in the Miles defense. So if we want to, we don't have to place a knight on f3. What we can do is we could transpose into a Vienna. So this is an option. We could just play knight to c3. And of course, the whole point behind knight to c3 is that now, if f5 gets played, we can just simply play e takes f5, and since there's absolutely nothing to kick, this has to be decisive advantage white, and in fact, it is. But what if they do something else? They're not going to play f5, we played knight c3. Well, we're in the mainline Vienna, so of course they could follow the mainline Vienna. And we can actually follow this really famous game. They could play e takes f4, and then we could play d4, and then they could play queen h4 check, and we could play king e2. And this is actually theory. And this is supposed to be okay for white. White's intending to play knight f3, and white's intending to play king f2. And we're actually following more than one game here. We're following, we could follow a modern game, Manjara versus Fedosiv, that was played on Lichess back in 2021. And that modern game continued with the move pawn to d6, knight f3, bishop to g4, bishop takes f4. And actually, at one point, Manjara had a decisive advantage with white, and he failed to win, and the game ended in a draw. But of course, from here, just kind of moving forward, it's just kind of a chess game from here. White has a compensation for the fact that his king is sort of misplaced. As a matter of fact, his king ended up not being misplaced in a few moves. It was kind of cute. It went castles, king e3, queen h5, h3, knight e5, bishop e2, bishop f3, and then everything got exchanged, and then the king doesn't look so ridiculous on f3 because there's so many pieces off the board. It's actually pretty safe. But if we go back, d6 wasn't the move that was played in the older game, where they actually played a little bit closer to what the computer recommends. In this game, Steinitz versus Dufresne's, played back in 1874, that game continued with the move queen to h5 check, knight to f3, and then g5, just holding the shield pawn. So this position is just super unclear. Black has the extra pawn, he's holding on to the shield pawn, and White's position with his king is a little uncomfortable. In that game, Steinitz played a move that was actually approved of by the computer. It was knight to d5, forcing the black king to move, and then he played king f2, and now he's kind of getting out of the woods with his king. He's preparing to develop his pieces. The position is just very unclear. Steinitz did go on to win the game. That was Steinitz versus Dufresne's, played back in Great Britain back in 1874. But again, the position's unclear, playable for both sides. So going all the way back to this stuff, why play knight c3 when we can play knight f3, and are we really that worried about pawn to f5? So if, again, you're making the argument that if exchanges happen in the middle, this knight on f3 is going to be uncomfortable, you could just do something really simple. You could just say, well, what if I just defend everything? And that's a totally reasonable thing to do, and as a matter of fact, after you play d3, the only person that could have an advantage here should be white. And that was kind of the logic in the game between Ivanchuk and Nakamura, played back in 2010. Ivanchuk had the white pieces and continued with d3. And actually, the game continued a little comically after that. They ended up with a totally symmetrical position. They went d6, knight c3, knight f6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7. And of course, the only person that can be better here is Ivanchuk. So Ivanchuk has a very slight edge here, and as a matter of fact, Ivanchuk went on to win. But of course, the position is very, very close to equality, and there's not a ton to fight for here, but if anybody's better, it's certainly white. White should have some sort of slight advantage. So anyways, so going back, the big question, is, do we care? The argument that black's making is that this knight on f3 is misplaced because if we exchange in the middle, if we play e takes f5, that black is going to play e4 and this knight's going to be uncomfortable. Okay, let's test this out. We put the knight on e5. We're threatening queen h5 check. Our knight on e5 has plenty of retreat squares. We have knight to c4, knight to g4 are both retreat squares. If we get really desperate, we can exchange it for the knight on c6. So our knight on e5 isn't going to get trapped. We're threatening queen h5 check. What's going on here? What's black doing? What do we really have to worry about? Well, there's really only two tries that black has here. Black can play something like knight takes e5, or black can play a move like knight f6. So let's just look at each of these tries sort of in turn. Is knight takes e5 anything that we have to worry about? Well, knight takes e5, f takes e5, and you'll note that queen h4 check followed by queen captures e4 is not a possibility because in chess we have this rule where you are not allowed to capture your own pawn. So the pawn on e4, it's actually kind of annoying for black. He doesn't want his own pawn on the e4 square. So black is going to have to continue with something like queen e7. We're going to be playing queen h5 check. That's going to force the king to move. Then we're going to have pawn to d4, holding that pawn temporarily. E takes d3, bishop takes d3. Now these are all sort of computer-best moves, and we're also following a game here. We're following a game Fear versus Hammer, played back in 2009. And that game continued queen takes e5, and both players, by the way, are playing computer-best moves. King to d1, knight to f6, queen back to f3, bishop to c5, knight to c3. I can only assume this was all preparation because, again, it's all computer-best. I have no comments on any of this. Going to d4, rook e1, queen f2, an exchange of queens, rook e2, bishop back to d4, bishop to g5, c6, king d2, rook e8, rook e1, takes, and this should just be slight edge white. And as a matter of fact, Hammer went on to win this game with the black pieces, but white didn't start making mistakes until the next move. The game continued d5, and then white sort of made his first mistake of the game. He played pawn to g4, and he's still a little bit better after pawn to g4, but he made a few further mistakes and then eventually went on to lose. What's very interesting is knight to d1, at least according to the engine, is still major advantage white. So white is actually still doing pretty good here. White has the advantage. White has the more advanced 3-on-2 on the king side, and this is better than the 4-on-3 that's essentially in the middle of the board. So having the 3-on-2 and having a more advanced pawn majority should be an advantage in this particular endgame, and the fact that white has more development and a slightly more active king position should all just mean that this position is advantage white. So going back, we're not that worried about knight takes e5. If knight f3 and then, we move our knight to e5, if they take it, we're not that worried. It seems like white's doing okay. So that leaves the other option. That leaves this move knight to f6. And so what should we play here? Well, according to the engine, we should just develop. We should play knight c3. And then we have queen e7 hitting that knight. And again, we have plenty of retreat squares. And here we can just utilize one of those. We don't really want to play knight c6 and, speed up black's development. But we can play knight to g4. And knight g4 is perfectly fine. Not only is knight g4 perfectly fine, we're loosening up the position of the black knight, which is going to, after knight g4, queen g4, reiterate that threat of queen h5 check and make that a very scary threat. And as a matter of fact, if they continue aggressively, like if they play knight to d4, we can play knight d5, which attacks the queen and still threatens the queen to h5. And if they play something like knight c2 check, which would be a question mark move, king d1, queen f7, bishop c4 should be completely winning. For example, knight takes a1, knight c7 check, picks up the queen on f7, so that's game over. So knight c2 obviously is a lemon. They're going to have to play something else. They're going to have to play queen d8, but that runs into queen h5 check, g6, fg6, bishop g7, gh7 check, king f8, c3, just kind of laughing at that knight. And again, if the knight dives in, knight c2, king d1, knight takes a1, this position is completely lost after queen f5. White is totally winning here. Queen f5 check, and black essentially has nothing. If, for example, bishop to f6, we're going to play knight takes f6, d6, knight d7, king e7, bishop to c4, bishop takes d7, queen f7 would be mate, would be one example. Another example, if instead of bishop f6 we were to play something like king to e8, simply bishop e2 threatening bishop h5, mate is kind of game over. There's not really much of anything black can do to stop these threats. I guess you can sacrifice a whole rook, but that's equally game over. Your king is still in the mating net, and then you're going to be down a rook on top of that. So you're just completely lost here in every possible way after bishop to e2. So that's sort of the point, I guess, is we're not worried about any of this stuff. We're not worried about, if I play my knight to e5, we're not worried about knight takes e5, even though maybe objectively this is black's best attempt. And we're not worried about knight f6 because we just have knight c3, and if you kick that knight away, we go back to g4, and we're coming in with queen h5, and everything is going good. So that's how we should be meeting this Miles defense, is probably we should just accept the challenge, play knight to e5, and we're doing good. But if you're scared of it, or they have some other preparation, or you're frightened of some other idea they might come up with, you can always decline the gambit here with d3, and of course you can always transpose into the Vienna one move earlier. So those are both options as well. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful, I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.